Hello, and welcome to It's Going to Be Alright. My name is Niklas Minturovic.
And I'm Clayton Gwen.
And today we're going to talk about narratives. And
It's
what is
story
that?
time.
Story time, that's what it is.
Episode, for the whole episode, it's just one big story time.
I should have started this this introduction with once upon a time there was a podcast called It's Going to Be Alright.
The one thing that we didn't put into our show notes for this episode. But yeah, narratives. This is something we've been meaning to talk about for quite a while, and how you tell a story in your scientific writing. So that's basically what we're talking about. I'm going to use the term narrative and stories interchangeably, but I don't know, Nicholas, you'll do the same?
I'll do the same. And
okay.
To be honest, narrative, I've seen a lot of people within academia that's been using the word narrative because it probably sounds a little bit more academic. Maybe. But it means the same as a story. You could say that a narrative, like any given sentence, is in a way a narrative because it's built up in a certain way that it's supposed to make sense. You want to communicate some type of information. So a sentence could be a narrative, but it's kind of hard to talk about a sentence as a story. A sentence is usually a part of a story. Mm-hmm. So let's say that narrative could just be the action of stitching together information to in the attempt to communicate it in the best way possible, maybe.
That sounds like a fairly apt description. And I like that you start with sentences because, yeah, sentences are the shortest story that you can tell. Yeah. But of course, they don't often have as much information as the larger narrative of a full research article or an essay, a course assignment, or a final thesis.
It could be one word. Stop.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true. It's a story. It's very short, but it's a story.
Maybe lacking some context. We could go off onto the creative writing side of all of this and, tell the best story you can in 4 words or less. And I can't remember who it was, but some famous author, anyways, John Steinbeck or Mark Twain or someone like that it was for sale, baby shoes, never used. And, yeah. And what a powerful story that is in one sentence. I mean, okay, that was 6 words, I suppose. But that's a really famous example of a narrative and how much information is packed in there. But there's a lot of other elements that create that sort of narrative. And so what I think is maybe kind of the important thing to point out. Oh, go for it. This is a digression, at least to a certain extent, but that is its own kind of subgenre within poetry. And writing like a limerick or a haiku or something, right? They try to condense as much meaning into the shortest amount of space as possible. So there's one poem, right? Norwegian poem. I'm just going to translate it freely, but it's very short and it will probably sound a little funny in English, but we try. Go for it.
A man plays on a flute. Spring. That's it.
Cool.
That's it. It's a very famous Norwegian poem, and you can think whatever you want about it. The point is that the purpose is that there's so much context in a way. It connects to so many different things, right?
Yeah.
It's supposed to give you this feeling of spring, and you gotta think about
you as the reader
singing in the night and all that stuff that you connect through.
You as a reader kind of impart so much more meaning and understanding and context into it. And this is the thing. So why narratives? Well, we love narratives. The vast majority of what we know about humans has been passed down through stories about our history, written stories, oral stories, and we still, every single day, even though we're not really used to thinking about it, because we call it the news now, we don't call it news stories that much, or a news article, right? As opposed to saying, oh, I just read this news story. But that's what it is. It's also a story. Sure. So we have these stories everywhere, but Of course, there's kind of stylistic differences between maybe more of the creative narrative, the poetic narrative, the fictional narrative, and the scientific or academic narrative. But there's sort of, I think, a key reason why having a narrative is really valuable when you want to write about science and write about your academic research, because not only do people love stories, but a narrative is something that is much more compelling than just facts. And if you want people to read your research, you want them to find it to be compelling, interesting to them, maybe something that they're to get them curious or to get them excited. But basically, you're trying to create an emotional involvement, that there's some personal value in reading this article, this piece of science or this piece of academic research, because you could learn something that might be valuable for you in your own life.
And I think you try to create like a world where all these things happen. You started to talk about how stories has been an integral and an extremely important part of human history. You could think about ancient religions like Hinduism, for example. That was never written down. Like for, I don't know, 6,000 years or something, it was an oral tradition. But all the, it seems like a lot of details was still preserved because it was put into this, giant cosmological kind of context where all these different morals and ethics and anything had their place, had characters that represented them. And so I think one thing, it makes it a lot more compelling, and it's also, in a way, more similar to how you experience your own life and how you make sense of things that is happening to you and your hopes for the future. So that's probably why that is the most, I would say, compelling way to deliver any type of information. And now I kind of started rambling a little bit right now, but
it's okay. It's story time. Like I said, a whole hour of story time. But
the point is that even in a scientific article, it's important to kind of put all these facts into its own world. That will make it a lot easier to follow and also a lot more interesting and more informative usually, because these bits and pieces of information doesn't really just exist on their own. Like they are part of a whole, and it's I think it's important to say something about that whole, because that will make it a lot easier for the reader to understand why your research is important, how to use it.
Establishing some kind of a context or some kind of a background that provides understandability. Okay, before we get into some of these, like I've got them listed in our show notes as like the elements, but I kind of want to stick on this question of like, why are narratives so valuable to us, and why don't we really put as much focus, when you're a student going through university, you're probably never told, for this course assignment, I want you to write a narrative. Write a research essay. So the narrative is more of kind of a concept or an idea that helps you to write more effectively and communicate in a more compelling way. So I'm not necessarily saying that a narrative is a specific format or style. It's more of like a component or an approach to writing that can be very valuable. And a case in point would be, do you watch TED Talks?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure that many people in the listening audience are probably familiar with TED Talks. The majority of them are, or at least the majority of them that I watch, I can't maybe speak to all of the TED Talks, but they are people who are researchers or are scientists. I mean, there's plenty of people as well who are just
a lot of the time
very experienced in certain things or have a particularly interesting outlook on certain things. But a lot of them have conducted research. So why do we watch TED Talks? Like, why do TED Talks get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of views? Because there's a narrative component that is incredibly compelling that pulls people in. And I used to do public speaking and thesis defense workshops while I had the time for it. And a big part of what I would really try to get across and communicate to the people who took those workshops is the first 30 to 60 seconds of an oral presentation is the most important to hook your audience's attention. And if you don't get them interested by creating a compelling introduction, you're not really going to hold their interest. You're not going to hold their attention through the 15, 20, 30, 45 minutes that you might have. So the use of hooks, and people have analyzed this stuff in TED Talks. There's, I don't know, maybe 10 or a dozen of like the most commonly used hooks that you can go and research this and see how to use them in the way that they're done. But they're things like, starting with a personal story, or starting with a statistic, or starting with a value statement.
A lot of it does that. Start with with a personal story. I was interested in Alzheimer's because my father suffered from something like that. Make it very personal, make it intimate, because we love people who talk about. Most people love to talk about themselves and love stories that they can relate to on a more personal level. And he said also start with a statistic that might be quite shocking or easily misinterpreted or something like that. Like
totally
1/3 of the population does something, and then like, whoa, that's a lot of people. And then there's a twist, right?
Yeah, and now you're sucked
interest.
in. There's something that's grabbed your curiosity, but it's grabbed your curiosity because it is personally important to you as a listener or as a reader. So I think that's maybe the main purpose of having a narrative is, your research is probably interesting to you as a researcher, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be interesting to the everyday average person or even other people within your field if you're not thinking of ways to make it compelling and interesting for them.
Sure.
So you have to kind of think about, so who is your audience, and how can you get them hooked on the story that you're trying to tell, which is your research. So I think that's maybe a good starting point of thinking about why use a narrative to hook people and make your research interesting and compelling for them to keep reading from your introduction or from your abstract.
And I think even, let's say that you write for a broad audience or you write for a very specialized audience, the point here is that I think having an approach where you write in such a way that you kind of create your own universe is beneficial, because you might gonna have to or want to work with people from other disciplines, and then being able to showcase that you understand how your research is connected to a more complex world is important, and it's more interesting to read because it's not like super isolated. I'm not saying that isn't interesting, because it's probably lots of extremely complex and valuable research that is done in such a way. Very specialized audience, I guess. So and certain scientific disciplines are more in need of being in touch with its context than others. The social sciences, for example, is really hard to do a very isolated study of how a society works, because there's so many factors that you need to take into consideration that contributes to how this story unfolds.
Exactly. And so I came across this interesting concept while doing the preparatory work for this, and it was narratives and anti-narratives.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? I don't know if you had time to read that article. I skimmed through it, but I really thought that was sort of a good way of dichotomizing one of the main problems that you face as a researcher and scientific writer, is having to walk this line of narrative and anti-narrative.
I mean, we talked about this before the podcast, so I know.
We're cheating.
We're cheating. I know what the term means, but if I was just supposed to answer like I had no idea about what an anti-narrative was, I would just follow my gut, and that would be something like lamp table mask face. I am nothing. Like, I don't know, just it doesn't make any sense. That would be an anti-narrative to me, but I do understand that no one writes like that. Not even within. It's I would say an anti-narrative is more like an information dump. This is something that we've been talking about on previous podcasts, and also in all different kinds of workshops that we give. An information dump is basically just presenting a bunch of different facts. It might be just like a list of facts.
Just reporting. Well, okay. Information dumping comes in a couple of different forms. There's sort of the the redundant or pointless information dumps because the ideas are not well structured enough in the writing that there's no logical connection between why this information is being presented. And then there's maybe the more logical information dumps, which I kind of go in position as the boring research writing. Stuff that when you look over it, it's like, okay, these are just facts. These are just findings. Very limited discussion, very limited introduction. Conclusion doesn't really have anything substantial to contribute. Like, yes, there's a lot of information here, but man, is it hard to interpret. It's hard to understand the relevance of it.
Think about it like a
that kind of becomes
PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, I think
Like
that kind of
with no
becomes the
explanation.
anti-narrative. And maybe
Think
a better
about it
way
like
of
a
it. Oh, go for
PowerPoint
it.
slide with just a bunch of like bullet points with no explanation.
Yeah, lacks a lot of context.
Yeah.
So maybe a better way of describing the difference between the narrative and anti-narrative based on this article, which it's called, where is it in my show notes here? It comes from the Journal of Integrative and Comparative Biology, and it's called Narrative and Anti-Narrative in Science, How Scientists Tell and Don't Tell Stories. I'm going to link this in the show description, and we're going to come back to it because I think there's some interesting ideas with a couple of the resources that'll be linked in the show description that we want to talk about and share. But what I would say is from that perspective, it's more of like the old school way of writing within scientific disciplines that we're objective, we're neutral, we're bias free, we're simply reporting the facts about what we've done. And while that might have been some relevant way of writing, 20 or 30 years ago, 100, 300 years ago, even longer than that, we're in a world where there's so much more interdisciplinary integration. There is so much sort of specialization that is happening. There is so much more interest in kind of like evidence-based research or evidence-based policy making that science and the social world, I don't think, are as separate as they used to be. And so this anti-narrative of just reporting on facts has validity. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it's probably more useful when your intended audience is a very small, hyper-specialized sub-field of a discipline, and the intended purpose of your research is very narrow. You're probably testing a method or testing a hypothesis. So the
Just gathering
anti-narrative
information.
Yeah, so the anti-narrative holds value for highly specialized fields where the facts are probably more important than the story that you're trying to tell because, well, you don't need to craft a context or a narrative to get people interested. The people who read, I'm always using this journal as an example, the Journal of Microbial Virology, right?
The classic example.
Yeah, because when you read that, it's so highly specialized that the people who subscribe to that they're just going to be interested in that stuff anyways. So you don't rely on a narrative as much because the sort of overarching narrative of why this stuff is interesting and important, well, it's already kind of a part of that sub-discipline.
The readers have a lot of the
group,
narrative. They have a lot of the narrative in their head already.
Yeah.
It's
But
kind
you'll
of
probably
like,
face that.
let's
as
say
a
that
writer.
you play Minecraft and you're super into that, right? And you know all the different things you can do in Minecraft. And then there's an expansion pack that gives you some new things that you could do. A lot of the players that are very, very known to the game, they don't really need an explanation of how to use these new different things because they know it just by understanding the game so well. So
But
that's
if you're a
one-
normie like me, I'd have to ask, what the hell is Minecraft?
Sure.
Although,
it's a computer game. But
I know what Minecraft is, but I've never played it. I've never really looked at it. So, I have a very distant and incredibly superficial overview of what it is.
Which was kind of beneficial for this example because it... I mean, if you know a lot about the game, it is very easy to understand how new different mechanics would impact what already exists within the game and within that world. And then you don't need an explanation. It explains itself.
So maybe another way of explaining it, if we could do another example, would be sports. And sure, many people are familiar with sports and kind of the basic idea of why we do it, but you might not know the specific rules and regulations and approaches or techniques. So, I mean, we had talked about it, that show, The Queen's Gambit, about chess players and how intricate that as a game or even, you know, an intellectual sport could be, all the way down to something like hockey. Okay, people have an understanding of what hockey is, but could anybody off the street tell you what offside is or icing?
Icing, yeah, probably not.
So in a way, you know, there's the rules of sport are kind of the story that needs to be told to help you understand what's actually happening. And I would say that science, every scientific field, is about telling stories, because we have stories that function to give us the prescribed methods, that we have stories that we tell that are the generally accepted theories that guide our understanding of how that discipline operates. And the way that we communicate our scientific discoveries are also stories. Now, this isn't my own idea. I'm stealing this one from, the author's name was Kevin Padian, and that was from the Integrative and Comparative Biology article that I'll link in the show description. But you can think about it as his examples were, biology is telling the story of life on Earth and evolution. And that got me thinking then, well, what is the field of geology? As a science, it's telling the story of Earth's creation and geologic evolution. Chemistry tells us the story of chemical interactions and the different chemical elements, how they react, how they can build, molecular chemical compounds. Physics is the story of everything. How do things interact and why? Social sciences would be the stories about how and why people interact and build certain institutions or rules of interaction, social systems. Yeah. And philosophy is the story of, far more abstract things that...
hard one to pin down.
Yeah, it's very hard to pin down.
In our time, it's for the most part very similar to what you do in the social sciences. It's mostly about how you think and why you think a certain way and how you interact with your environment. Back in the day, it was, it would include physics, it would include math, and would include everything. It was more like the experimental field of any type of scientific discipline before they even had a name.
Exactly.
Kind of.
And so within all
just
these...
an interesting thing, talking about this anti-narrative approach. If we talk about social sciences, I told you this before we started the recording, but I can say it again. When I was a student, I was a master's student at University of Oslo in cultural history. And I took a course that was called like the cultural history of death or something. Sounded super Scandinavian. And I had this professor. He was about to retire, I think. And most of the course literature was just stuff that he had written himself, for the most part. He's been, focused on this for his entire career. But his approach was very, to me, kind of very strange. I think I'm a person that kind of seeks meaning. So I'm always trying to interpret something. Like, what does this mean? Who am I? That kind of stuff.
And maybe we've talked about it too, that we really like what is the practical implication of the work.
What is the
as
practical
well.
implication? But also kind of just this philosophical wondering of, why is things the way they are? And then what can you do about it? That would be the more practical approach. But he didn't seem to be too interested in any of these kind of things. To him, it was more interesting to just collect facts. Collect information, just kind of create in a way, just map or statistics. So what he did, and this is true, we had a book, it was like this thick, about 1,000 pages, where he'd been traveling around Norway and Sweden, and Finland, I think, at least Norway and Sweden, and just going to graveyards and taking pictures of every tombstone. And just categorizing them, to which decade, and then categorizing them by which symbols that were present on the tombstone. So if it was a cross, if it was a star and a cross, if it was angels, if it had pillars, if it had that kind of... But he didn't...
So it would, if I could just ask one question, it was more that he is trying to trying to categorize,
He was categorizing,
the images to see what were the particular patterns of symbology used and how they might have evolved over time, kind of like that. It's a very obviously historical, but
it would be more like, let's say that in the 1890s, it was typical to have one pillar in each side, an angel on each side, and some kind of symbol. For example, and then in the 1950s, for example, it would be typical to have a much more stripped down stone with just a cross when you were born, no, a star when you were born, and a cross the time of your death.
So just descriptive research,
very descriptive, basically. And no interpretation. He wouldn't say anything like, because to me it would be, okay, so why did the tombstones look like that in the 1850s, for example? Why does this person has a two swords in a cross and something like that? But no, that was not his approach. It was purely descriptive.
Answering questions of what, not questions of why, not questions of how.
He was just, categorizing and kind of making statistics, I guess, but he wasn't really interpreting his findings. The only thing that it would kind of explain, they would tell a story on their own, but it would be, in my opinion, fairly superficial, in the sense that it would be in the 1920s, a typical gravestone in Norway and Sweden would look like this.
Yeah.
It would have these elements.
That's the extent of the narrative.
And why it wouldn't be...
Not answered.
Was never asked.
Not cared. So I think that makes a really good point in, where is the narrative or the quote-unquote anti-narrative valuable? So maybe that is obviously also a very specialized and probably narrow group of people who are looking at that issue.
I would say so.
Maybe that hadn't been done. So, this was something I wanted to talk about as well, too, that, as we start getting into figuring out, okay, so when is a narrative important to use and where is it valuable? It does really come down to a couple of different things. So obviously, what is the nature of your research? What's the type of research design that you're following? And if you're doing descriptive research, crafting a really compelling narrative is going to probably be more difficult because your results are just describing facts. You can have room for a narrative in the introduction and the conclusion, which could kind of inform, so what is the value? What is the scientific or academic contribution that I'm making by doing this? Well, it hasn't been done. So before we could ask any other questions about why or how, we kind of just need to know what and when. And that's a very reasonable starting point. But of course, I can understand why it would lack a very strong narrative, both being super narrow and being a type of descriptive research without really any attention on trying to express why that description is necessary.
I mean, you could think about it like this. If we think about science as a collective project, you could say that his main focus was to produce a fairly extensive data set. And then other researchers could interpret that data set using any type of method or, looking at different texts, for example, something like that. But he wasn't interested in that. He just wanted to create a data set, and then you could do whatever you want with it. But
didn't really care to have that explanation of the value of it to other researchers.
Sure. And another important thing here is that if he would focus his attention on interpreting as well, then he would have less time to gather data. So the data set wouldn't be that extensive. So, I mean, it wouldn't be that big. But it's not very interesting read.
Not necessarily.
Unless if
you're already very interested in that field of research and are compelled to read it because you have this interest. So I think this returns us to, how do you really figure out if the narrative approach versus the anti-narrative, just kind of descriptive fact building or database building writing approach is good for you? Well, what is the intention of your research and who is your intended audience? Those will be probably the biggest determining factors for you. And again, there's nothing wrong with that kind of factual writing approach. If you were doing something like writing a biography or doing, in his case, cultural history, the facts may be more important than your interpretation of them, or you may be hesitant even to interpret it, because there's enough historians who are trying to do that. We were talking about this in previous episodes, the Sapiens book and the Deus Sapiens, Dr. Yuval, can't remember his name, an Israeli historian. But those are very compelling reads because they're predominantly a narrative. There's an overarching hypothesis that is sort of being tested by explaining historical developments. So it's not to say that certain fields can't use narratives. It ultimately comes down to the author, right?
We also have to think about it. This is more from a pedagogical standpoint, but a lot of the old philosophers, they would also write like analogies and stuff to show the practical implications of some kind of philosophical idea. So they would put it within a frame, create a story that would illustrate how that would play out in a real scenario, or something like that. So because the philosophical principle might seem very abstract and kind of difficult to grasp on its own, so it needs context. The same goes for relatively complex math. I mean, you are interested in physics, and so am I, but not really. I mean, I'm really bad at math, so I can't do any equations on my own. But I can understand a lot of the more philosophical implications of quantum physics or something like that if they are explained to me in a way that makes sense to me, I guess. And that requires a narratological approach.
Yeah. And now we're starting to get into what are some of the key elements if you find value in creating a narrative, or realizing that even in the anti-narrative, there's still kind of an embedded narrative that just it's implicit. It goes without saying. So you need to have context, and you need to know your audience, and you need to know, obviously, within the confines of those two, what does the audience already know and what do they need to know to understand what's coming next. And what I want to do right now, and we should have said this at the start of the episode, but we've been doing a video format with this as well too, predominantly because we wanted to start showing some resources as well, which is what I'm going to do. So if you're just listening, we'll do our best to describe this. I will also share the link in the show description so you can look at this yourself. But we're probably going to, just due to the time demands of doing a podcast and the video editing associated with it, we're probably going to stop doing the full video version that we've been putting up on YouTube when we don't have resources or visuals to show. So we'll try to let you know in future episodes when there is associated video or not. But for those of you who are watching this on our YouTube channel, I think that it's really good to kind of get into this idea of thinking about a narrative through story circles, actually using storytelling devices. But what was really great is I came across a way that we can kind of take a story circle and put it into what's been called by these authors a plot spiral. And basically, for those of you who are listening, there's plots in drama and there's plots in scientific papers. And what you can see if you're looking at this is two circles that are split into three sections. You have section 1, section 2, and section 3, and within it there's kind of a spiral that goes around. So section 1 is the introduction, where you typically, in a drama or a novel, you're going to get introduced to the characters and the setting, and that leads into the second stage of the story, where there's tension, some kind of action needs to be done or put in place, which leads to a climax, and then it comes to a resolution in the third act as the story comes to its conclusion, and it cycles back. A lot of stories tend to be a bit cyclical, but they don't end exactly where they started. They kind of return to the main ideas or main themes that were presented, and there's something that's been learned. Something has changed, and we need to have where we started to understand where we ended up. And I think science, good scientific writing works in this same sort of way. So in the introduction, this is where we introduce the hourglass shape, but this plot spiral is quite useful to understand how what is introduced and what is concluded needs to also cycle back to itself. So you would start out with your introduction, the necessary background information of whatever it is that you're actually researching, ending your introduction with the problem. And then you get into the action. How are you studying this? What were the methods? What were the results? What are the results worth presenting? And from there, those are kind of the conclusive results that you're going to discuss, which then kind of goes and looks at, so what's the implications or the impact of the research that I've done? And the conclusion ends trying to tie onto the introduction. What was your hypothesis? What was your thesis statement? But it also extends to what comes next. What are the bigger sorts of questions that we can walk away from? Room for future research, or implications or recommendations, things that need to be done or done differently.
For some strange reason, both of these models are constructed so they move counterclockwise.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why it's presented the way that it is.
It's just confusing for me because I'm, kind of used to the clockwise motion.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know why they did it this way either. But the main idea is that a good narrative comes down to having a sort of structure like this that you can follow. And this is the most common approach to scientific writing, scientific reporting. Where you start and where you end need to have kind of a circle back. Did you answer your questions? Did you disprove the null hypothesis? So on and so forth. And that is the typical hourglass formula that we're used to seeing. It narrows from the introduction from something more general to specifically what you're doing. It broadens out in the discussion to the conclusion, reaching out to the wider audience and the wider implications of your research. And then it kind of looks to what comes next.
So we've strange connection to a lot of these old religions before we had, that was a part of an oral tradition. A lot of them were cyclical in a way, but it was cyclical with a change. It wasn't just like world repeating itself.
Yeah, exactly.
For an eternity with no. It would be more like a spiral.
It's more iterative than it is, completely cyclical. So the main idea with using a narrative structure like this in your science writing is you're already used to seeing that. That's everywhere in every kind of scientific article, and often in a lot of scientific books that you read as well too. Starts out general, moves into things that are more specific, kind of broadens back out as to what are the general conclusions that we can draw from this specific research, and where do we go now that this research has been done? What are the next questions to ask?
So, I mean, that is the same as any type of storytelling. So I'm just taking a quick peek at the show notes. Maybe we should try to connect this to like the key elements in a narrative, talking about setting, characters, stuff like that, because that's what make this in many ways.
It's what activates the story spiral or the plot spiral or story circle. Yeah. So the reason I presented this image and tried to describe it for our listeners is because this is sort of the formula that you can follow for crafting a narrative. But within it, obviously, there are these embedded elements. So
you need some components that will keep this moving. Yeah.
And so before we really go into writing the story, we always say the importance of being well prepared and having a good outline, getting the structure set up. So there's sort of three important things that are associated with this spiral, which is you need to know what your theme is, you need to know the structure or the logical order that you're presenting all of your ideas, and then you really need to have a clear understanding of what is the purpose of this writing. So maybe we should just dissect those before we go into the even more specific elements of narrative writing. So
just
what's a theme?
Quick too. What's the theme? You could say, let's say a theme in scientific writing could be a topic that you've chosen within your scientific discipline. And if we're talking about writing just a story like a novel or a fairy tale, a theme could be a setting, a world. And within that world, there's only certain things. I mean, if you write a story and anything can happen, it's usually not that much of a compelling read because it doesn't really
It's a lot of ex machinas happening all the time.
Yeah, and there's I mean, as a reader, you kind of anticipate something while you read, and while getting some surprises is always keeps you on the edge of your seat when you're reading. It should be within what's possible in a certain universe. So let's say that there's a story about like super realistic story, a love story, and suddenly there's a guy starting to levitate, right?
Yeah, and dragons appear,
Yeah,
and then
what?
aliens invade the Earth. It's a bunch of non sequiturs.
It would collapse.
Yeah.
And the same goes for scientific text, and that's why you should create an outline to really like connect all the different bits and pieces of your project and see how they work together.
Exactly. So this is, the kind of technical elements of your field, if you will. Knowing your theme, I would say, involves building that narrative world or the scientific world that you're working in. What are the core concepts that are going to be used? What are the core theories or philosophies that are going to be used? What is the methodological approach for data collection and for analysis? And how do those fit?
And what does it allow you to see?
Yes, because creating this theme is sort of framing in the world. What is possible through this research? And different disciplines have different approaches, different theories, different concepts to all of this stuff. But you need to know what your main themes are as your general starting point. So this is kind of just like that story or the plot spiral. We're starting with the general stuff. If you don't really know what your big picture is, it's going to be really tough to write a compelling narrative because you won't know what should be included and what shouldn't be included.
And that's also the way to write a good introduction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about it like this. Let's say that
establishing that context, letting the big themes be clear.
If you have, this is a crazy analogy, but let's say that you're a god, Clayton, the fierce.
I prefer Supreme Emperor of the Universe.
Okay, you can be that.
Yeah, all right.
And you teleport me straight into a dimension that you have created. And I don't know how it works. Then it would be really nice if when I'm teleported in, and suddenly I'm standing in the middle of a landscape and I don't know what's up and what's down, then you come over to me and you start describing. See over there? That's the mountains. I know they're inverted, but that's what it is. Mm-hmm. They're made of this and that. Let's go over. Now we follow this. This is a river. Like, introduce the reader to the landscape and all the important aspects of the story that is about to unfold.
Mm-hmm. That's what's going to bind things together and give the rules of the narrative, right? And once you know what your theme is, it gets a bit easier to figure out the most appropriate structure to take. But structure is also then related to things like the methods that you are using and the research design that you are trying to get across, the writing format. And this is one of the nice things that a lot of people can very easily go to, because if you're doing an experiment, you're just going to use the IMRAD structure, which we've talked about, endlessly in this podcast. You know how to establish an introduction, and then what are your methods, and what are the results from those methods, and then what's worth discussing. But not everything follows that format. If you're doing descriptive research, the IMRAD structure might be less useful for you. You might need to do a much more extensive thematic building or world building with a conceptual framework or a historical background, or potentially a review of the current field that you are in to point out why your research is important in the first place. So the nice thing is that if you have an idea of the themes and then the best kind of writing format or structure that you can end up taking, is it a report? Is it a case study? Is it an experimental design? Is it a methodological design? Is it a philosophical piece? Is it a review piece? We're going to have another episode on what all of these sorts of things mean as research designs. But knowing that kind of design that you take does help you to understand the structure that your writing can unfold under.
So let's say we have a topic, and that topic is best described through a certain research design. And that research design consists of certain components that will tell that story in the best way possible. It's kind of a way to simplify it.
Exactly. I'll give you an example as well, since we've got some video here. Not so important for those of you who are listening, but what I'm holding up is a report. It is a piece of scientific research that has been conducted, but it's not being published in peer review. It is an annual report on the Ronald Lake Wood Bison Research Program. So reports have a certain structure that you generally can follow, but it's going to have narrative elements that demonstrate things like, okay, what are the main things that we're looking at here? What are the themes? And what is the specific purpose, the objectives and the goals that we are actually doing and reporting on in this report? So that would be a more practical example. And we're used to seeing these things all the time. Peer-reviewed articles, that's a type of structure that you can follow. An official report, a literature review, a meta-analysis. All of those are types of structures. And they're logically presented, that they'll still have many of these thematic elements that need to be presented in the introduction. What happens in the middle can vary. Are there headings and subheadings, and, does it go immediately to the methods and the results, or does it need to have a more extensive background or a philosophical, theoretical, conceptual framework that really defines the use of the themes that you're using? And then, of course, we need the purpose, right? Mm-hmm. What are the specific goals that you're trying to accomplish with this writing? So, of course, we talked endlessly about this too. The best way to figure out your purpose is, are you looking at a problem, a puzzle, or a gap? And that purpose justifies why you're doing your research, which is also a compelling part of the narrative. If there's a problem, why is it a problem for the field, and who is affected by the problem? If it's a puzzle, why are there so many different viewpoints? And what do they actually really mean when we bring them together? Are there patterns of agreement? Are there patterns of disagreement? Are there simply different schools of thought that are starting to split but aren't really yet clearly defined? And if there's a gap, what don't we know? Why don't we know it? Because
there's a clear objective, no
Yes.
matter what kind of objective it is. And think about it like, a fairy tale or any type of story, it's usually very easy to understand what the main character is about to do. What is the purpose of the journey? There's obviously stories where, that is a little bit vague or unclear, or you get a notion of what this adventure is about when the adventure is on its way. And maybe it's adventuring for the sake of adventuring, who knows?
Yeah.
But in an academic text, it's very important that it's easy to follow. There shouldn't be any surprises. So that's a big, difference between an academic writing and storytelling within academia and just writing a novel.
Yeah. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of twists in science
and there shouldn't
writing.
be.
Yeah.
There shouldn't be. And if there is a twist, if you're a student,
Probably
you're
because
gonna
of
get a bad
methodological
grade.
failure, right?
Yeah, you're going to get a bad grade.
Yeah.
If you suddenly introduce new theoretical concepts in the discussion that hasn't been presented earlier, or new results out of a sudden show up in the discussion section, that's a problem. That would be a twist. That would be a plot twist, and that would just be, as you said, like weak research.
Yes. So that's a good starting point to think about building your narrative. What's your theme? What's the appropriate structure and order to place the ideas in? And what's your specific purpose? And then, of course, deal with who is your audience as well. All of that stuff helps to define a lot of how you can end up structuring your narrative. But of course, you brought up this really good point that, once you have that stuff figured out, like, okay, then what is the story? You need to have characters who go on the adventure. So we can actually think from that same resource where the plot spiral came from. They pointed out a couple of important elements to writing a good scientific narrative and how they parallel with a lot of novel writing or fiction writing. So you need to know also, what are the main characters? And we talk about this a lot at the Writing Center, that we want active voice as much as possible. Make the character, the thing that you're researching, the subject, not the object of sentences. And that's grammar level stuff. But we need to know our characters. We need to provide a setting. We need to describe the setting for our readers. And that's stuff that is going to end up kind of building in the introduction and following that general down towards specific model, where we come to the tension. So what is the problem, the puzzle, or the gap, your hypothesis or your thesis statement? The action is then what we do to address that tension. What are the methods? What are the results? The climax becomes what you discuss, the really important results that you have found and what they potentially mean. And then we come to the resolution in our conclusion. So then what does your specific findings, what you at the climax, what does that mean for the much wider field?
And just to make something clear, a character could be anything that you're writing about. Let's say that we're talking about the theory chapter of a social sciences research project. And in that theory chapter, there's a framework. And that framework that consists of 10 concepts. You can think about each concept as a character. You have to choose your cast. You can't choose too many because then it will be difficult to follow. So you need to have a cast, right? And each cast member needs to have a specific purpose. Need to be chosen, handpicked for that purpose. That's how to create a theoretical framework. And then when it's time to discuss, you're discussing your results. Let's say that you're trying to interpret your results using these theoretical concepts, that cast. You've chosen them because they are useful in different settings. So the results, that could be different results could be viewed as different characters, but the theoretical concepts that you decide to use could also be characters that are interacting with each other and creating some kind of action.
They provide the background. They provide the setting, the context.
Sure, and they create an outcome.
Yeah.
When you combine different characters, they interact with each other.
They interact. They have actions on each other, and those are the actions used to collect data, to then analyze and then interpret the data that you have.
And these outcomes, that could be your, how you interpret your most important findings, for example. And that could be, let's say that there's a list of outcomes that is the product of the discussion section. That's what you bring on into the conclusion and usually just restate. It would be your interpreted most important findings.
Yeah. I would say one of the problems that a lot of people have with completing the narrative is you get so focused on your climax, your specific results from the specific research that you have done, that they just kind of conclude with that. This is what I found. And they forget the resolution. A climax, it's sort of like what happens if in a movie or a story, there's like the epic climactic battle between good and evil and it fades to black. So what happened, right? And what are the greater implications for some of the non-characters or lesser characters for the whole world that
how
had been
does that
developed?
affect all the inhabitants of this world?
What is the larger implication of that epic climatic battle? And, what are the stakes if good or if evil wins?
Sure.
And obviously, we're so used to the wonderful, good always prevails, and then what do you end up seeing in a lot of those stories? Think about The Lord of the Rings. And many people, if you've read the books or I'm sure you have probably seen the movies, what happens? Yeah, they follow the main characters back to, the wider implications of what they had done. Returning home and everyone's so happy to see them. And there's not even a whole lot of dialogue in the last, 10 minutes of the last Lord of the Rings movie. It's just music and, kind of a fuzzy filter effect and bright lights.
But there's also some other stuff. I mean, obviously it's not a Lord of the Rings podcast, but there's also this kind of melancholic type of thing when they travel over the gray ocean and the adventure is over and they are emotionally scarred, and they kind of should be when walking through Mordor. It's not not a good experience. You get traumatized by walking through Mordor.
Exactly. So what are the
point is
implications of that? And then it resolves itself by also kind of posing a new adventure that happens that we don't get to know about. That's the end of the story, and we're left wanting more. So what happens when they go and cross, I can't remember, the
Great
Great
Oceans.
Sea to the land of the Undying, right?
Over the Grey Oceans,
Yeah.
Into kind of like a very misty kind of abstract world that you don't know too much about. And even in the Silmarillion, there's not that much information about that place. A little bit, but not too much.
So our research writing does the same sort of thing. It's great that you found your conclusions, but who really gives a damn about them? What do they mean to the broader field? What comes next? What recommendations can you make? What questions do you have that remain unanswered that are important to answer to fully understand this? And that is sort of the broadening, that as we cycle our way back to our introduction, that we should have demonstrated from, the thesis statement or the hypothesis that we presented a satisfying conclusion. Sometimes that satisfying conclusion is simply, we need to do more research.
The strange thing is, if you're going to keep the Lord of the Rings analogy alive, like, okay, so what happened? Aragorn became the king, the return of the king, right? The hobbits went back to the Shire, where they've been kind of living in a bubble, not really aware of any of these of anything. So the story connects to all these different places, and how is the outcome of the ring getting destroyed and Sauron getting destroyed? How does that affect all these different places that the main characters have been visiting throughout the whole story?
Exactly.
That's how you should try to kind of. The same thing goes for research.
Yeah,
I would
let's
say.
put it into a more scientific example. Being from Canada, I've been following the polar vortex as it has been separated or ripped apart, however they had described it. Now, I was reading about this about a month ago when we were having all this really great sunny weather and cold weather here in Norway. And now you're reading that places like Texas and Mexico have been, minus 18, minus 20 degrees.
Yeah,
it's
super
been
cold.
snowing. Okay, so, we can kind of go and look at the research that had been around something like this, which, writers were saying, well, here are things that we can this is what we're predicting from our models, and the more extreme weather that we can predict to happen in the future. And in some ways they were correct. The polar vortex split. There came this really intense and very unseasonable weather that extended much further than it usually does. But there's suddenly a bunch of other questions. It's like, well, why did this happen? Because our previous climatic models were saying that we should expect, more severe weather, but much warmer climates. So why are we getting minus 20 and minus snow down into Texas so far in the United States? And, there's that's partly the implication that had been talked about, and, all of the recommendations that we should prepare for more extreme weather. But there's also this area of future research. So why didn't our models predict that it would be these more intense, colder periods? And now that has allowed researchers to go and look at, because, there are these implications, but also room for future research when the models don't add up to reality that we're seeing. Oh, well, now we have to go and jump in and research all of this stuff. And it comes with, I can't remember all of the technical terms because I'm not a meteorologist, but the polar vortex and its oscillation is, as it gets destabilized, not only can it kind of tear apart and create these different weather patterns in the northern hemisphere, but instead of it being a fairly steady rotation around the Arctic, it starts to wobble like a top when if you know what those are, you spin them and then at the end centrifugal force holds it up, but as it starts to wobble, it gets more erratic. And so that's what they're thinking is now happening, is that this polar vortex is creating almost like waves. It's less circular than it had been, and it's becoming more like a series of troughs and bows,
which makes me really wonder what the end of that story is, because when you use a spinning top, it starts to wobble. After that, it usually just loses balance and just falls.
Yeah.
So what's the end of this story?
Exactly. You see that, this is becoming a more and more compelling story because this non-human character, the polar vortex, and this other character are climatic models, were not interacting in the way that we expected them to, or they weren't lining up as predicted. So what does that mean? Well, what's the tension? We are unable to accurately predict these things. So what's the action that needs to be taken? Okay, well, we need to improve our models. And what is sort of the climax and the conclusion of this? Well, as we've studied it over the years and seen, we're seeing more intense, colder but short extreme periods. So on average, yeah, the world is warming up, but we're also seeing the statistical trend of very intense, very localized, extreme cold weather patterns, which, because they only last for such a short period of time, a couple days, maybe a few weeks, it kind of is obscured by the larger model. But that's the interesting story to get in and tell, because the implications don't have impact on these non-human characters. And this is maybe the important takeaway for many people, especially if you work in the natural sciences or in technology and stuff like that. What is the human implication of the work that you have done? Because it's humans who are going to continue doing the research in the future, right? It's humans who are going to be interested in reading this stuff. And that's why I think the narrative ends up being so crucial to really be able to think about as a writer.
And once again, I mean, if you manage to create a narrative that someone can associate with, that what makes it really powerful, no matter what it is about. So when you talk about weather, I mean, I think a lot about the weather because I'm very interested in climbing. So I want to be able to go outside and climb on dry stone, right? I do obviously understand that it can't be dry all the time, and I'm just trying to say that I pay close attention to the weather and temperature and stuff like that. And over the last few years, it's been like suddenly 1 month of 33 plus Celsius and not rain a single. I've never experienced that throughout my whole life before a couple of years ago here in Norway. Just dry as in Spain. Grass is turning brown.
All the fire bans last summer.
Yeah. And
last winter even. Yeah.
Last winter and all the farmers, nothing want to grow, everything dries. It's like, and then you suddenly have like 2 months of extreme wind. And then rain. Rain for 2 months straight. And then suddenly very dry, and it seems like I wonder if this spring is going to be as dry as last spring. You remember that?
Yeah.
After the lockdown.
Everybody was up on Grefsenkollen having campfires all the time. And they were sending out police helicopters to stop people because there was a fire ban in place.
I mean, I was out climbing almost every day since March until summer or something.
Yeah.
Which was cool, but it was very
biking and walking so much.
It was just dry,
but yeah,
no rain.
So that is sort of the thing that as a researcher, especially if you're looking at these sort of non-human characters, they have implication in the human world that we live in. And, more like a personal story time, I was talking to a friend of mine. His brother is studying circuitry and machine learning and some stuff like that in electrical engineering. And he was writing his thesis last year on developing some improved components for underwater photography and infogrammetry. I'm probably not even saying the right word there. But I ended up, he could tell me all about this technology that he was working on. And I said, so what's the point of doing all of this? And he didn't have an answer for me. Yeah. And I was able to sit there and talk with him, and we're at a party and we're having beers and stuff like that. But I thought it was really interesting that, because what I could see is, man, marine ecologists and marine biologists could totally use this stuff. Because if you're telling me that it's more effective and it's more efficient, well, if it costs less to purchase, if it lasts longer, if it gives better results, there's a huge financial reason to do this. There's
also a scientific reason. Let's say it has higher resolution. I mean, then you could see more details, and
all he was focused on was finding ways to improve efficiency. that he couldn't see the implications of what that efficiency could really mean. So it was a fun little conversation. I got to learn a lot about electrical engineering and that whole world of stuff. But I think that this is really something that a lot of people end up suffering from because we're never presented with this idea of a narrative as a student. So we're never really thinking about the implication other than we're trying to create knowledge for knowledge's sake, which is also a valuable endeavor. But again, you know, especially you and I, we talk about this a lot. What is the practical value of that knowledge if it can't be used for anything? If it can't solve a problem, if it can't help us get a better understanding of something, if it doesn't necessarily even very well fill a gap in our understanding.
And just and I guess one thing is just kind of figuring out what is useful and what is not useful, but also how to use some kind of abstract idea. Like how can we turn that into a practical action? How can we make that idea, which seems very abstract, very isolated, how can you make that into an action that will affect your surroundings? For better or for worse.
Yeah. So maybe we can leave people with a little bit of homework this time.
Yeah.
When you're reading your scientific texts, articles, books, whatever it may be, sift through the introduction. Can you see how they're developing the main themes? Can you see what the main characters of the study are going to be? Can you see how they establish a setting by giving you the necessary background information to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it? Do you see how they establish tension by pointing out problems, puzzles, or gaps, and then making the claim either through a hypothesis or a thesis statement of how they could potentially solve those issues? Can you see the types of actions that are useful to address the tension? Can you see how they're building up in their discussion towards the climax that's going to form resolution in their conclusion? And does that conclusion cycle back to the issues that they presented in the introduction, but also not only resolve those issues, the problems, puzzles, or gaps that were presented, but move beyond that? And if you can go through and see all of that stuff, it's going to be a huge help for you, and hopefully it's going to make you a bit of a better writer. And as we always say,
it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right.
It's going to be all right, people. Niklas, thanks again for another excellent podcast. And
thank you.
Again,
fun conversation.
Yeah, this was a good one. But please, everybody, go check our show notes for some more like practical examples of all of this. I've got resources that will be listed in there. If you've got topics or things that you'd like to hear us discuss and cover, writingcenter@nmbu.no. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, we're just going to keep talking about the stuff that we think is interesting.
And by looking at the show notes, you can also see how far we strayed off topic.
Yeah.
Also, that's also fun.
Worthwhile, though. All right, everybody. Until next time.